Welcome to the podcast to preserve, protect, and defend the soul of America.
The topic we shall discuss in today's show is the weight of unwanted animals.
And I am your host, Alex.
And I am Sam.
Before we even look at a single piece of modern data today, I really want you to visualize something. Picture the 5 boroughs of New York City.
Right, a massive population.
Exactly. Now imagine every single one of those 8 million human residents is replaced by a dog or a cat. And imagine that entire population being wiped out, completely eliminated, not, over a decade, but every single year after year.
It's hard to even wrap your head around that.
It really is. But that staggering, frankly, incomprehensible scale of death was the actual reality of the American shelter system back in 1973.
It is a phenomenal starting point for our deep dive today because it just forces you to confront the sheer arithmetic of what we used to accept as totally normal. We are unpacking a topic today that is, without exaggeration, one of the most profound public health and moral achievements in American history.
Yeah, a 97% decline in shelter euthanasia over the last 50 years, which is just, it's wild.
It is. And to anchor this for you, the listener, the subtitle of the source material we are diving into today is The American Shelter System, the No-Kill Movement, and the Human Problem That Shelters Cannot Solve.
We're going to explore exactly how we achieved that 97% drop and did it without a single overarching federal mandate. But, and this is the core of our mission today, we have to talk about why that triumph, which looks absolutely incredible on paper, is built on a foundation that is actively fracturing underneath us right now.
To understand why the current system is cracking, you really have to understand what it was built on in the first place. When you walk into a modern animal shelter today, you kind of expect to see brightly painted walls, adoption counselors, play yards.
Right. You view it as a temporary refuge, a place to go find your family's next best friend.
Exactly. But you have to completely strip that modern perception away. The system was never designed to be a refuge. It was designed, quite literally, as an instrument of municipal sanitation.
Literally. The word pound comes from the Old English word pund, which just means an enclosure. And if you go back to the early 19th century in cities like New York or Boston or Philadelphia, you wouldn't just see stray dogs. You would see pigs, goats, cattle, and these massive packs of feral dogs and cats just roaming the cobblestones.
Yeah, eating garbage, spreading disease, causing carriage accidents. It was chaos.
Total chaos.
And for the rapidly emerging bourgeois class in these cities, this was just an intolerable display of urban disorder. So the creation of the city pound was a direct, pragmatic response to a sanitation crisis. The objective was capture, a brief holding period to see if an owner claimed their property, and if not, disposal.
And we need to be incredibly clear about what disposal meant in the 19th century. It was literal, and it was violently crude. It is genuinely horrifying to read about in the text.
It really is.
These animals weren't receiving a quiet, peaceful injection. They were clubbed in alleys. They were driven in cages into New York's rivers and systematically drowned by the hundreds.
It's brutal.
They were shot. And then later on, they were put into the backs of these retrofitted trucks that actually used the engine exhaust as an improvised gas chamber.
That extreme brutality is what finally prompted Henry Bergh to step in. He founded the American Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, the ASPCA, back in 1866. Bergh was this wealthy diplomat who was just profoundly appalled by this daily violence in the streets.
Right, couldn't stand it.
So he began a vigorous campaign for what was, at the time, considered a humane alternative, which was electrocution.
Which sounds crazy to us now.
It does, but it took decades of advocacy, and his early efforts eventually laid the groundwork for what would become the standard by the mid-20th century, which is sodium pentobarbital injection, which, still the standard method of euthanasia used today.
But that creates an incredibly dark paradox, doesn't it? Because for an entire century, organizations like the ASPCA and the Humane Society found themselves basically wearing two conflicting hats.
Oh, completely.
On one hand, they were moral advocates, preaching that a civilized society is judged by how it treats its most vulnerable creatures. But on the other hand, they held the actual municipal contracts to operate as the executioners, killing millions of animals a year.
It was a deeply uncomfortable tension for them. And it brings us right back to that 1973 baseline you mentioned at the top of the show. 1973 is a watershed year in the data because it was the first time the Humane Society managed to compile a serious national estimate of exactly how many dogs and cats were being killed in American shelters annually.
And the number they published was 13.5 million.
Yeah. And other estimates from that exact same period ran as high as 20 million. Let's do the math on that 20 million figure just so you can truly grasp the mechanics of this system. 20 million animals a year means more than 54,000 animals killed every single day.
54,000 every day.
That translates to more than one dog or cat killed every 2 seconds. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, nonstop.
One animal every 2 seconds. The pound was just a terminus. If an animal went in, it was statistically highly unlikely to come out alive. And because this volume of death was so relentless, the culture inside the shelter system had to adapt just to survive the psychological toll of it all.
They had to cope somehow.
Exactly. So the workers reframed the killing as an act of profound mercy. They convinced themselves they were putting animals out of their misery. But the tragic reality was that for millions of these animals, their only quote-unquote misery was being perfectly healthy in a concrete building that simply ran out of cage space on a random Tuesday afternoon.
Right. And you really have to ask yourself, how on earth did America generate an annual surplus of 20 million dogs and cats in the first place?
Where did they all come from?
Exactly. To answer that, you have to look at the massive demographic and economic shifts of the post-World War II era. Before 1945, a dog was largely a rural working animal. It herded sheep, it kept rats out of the barn, it guarded the property line. It wasn't, sleeping at the foot of a child's bed in cul-de-sac.
Precisely. But then the war ends. You have the GI Bill, the explosion of the federal highway system, and this massive migration into single-family suburban homes.
The creation of modern suburbia.
Yeah. Suddenly, millions of American families have fenced-in backyards and unprecedented disposable income. The dog in the yard became a fundamental component of the post-war suburban consumer ideal, right alongside the two-car garage and the color television set. Dog ownership transitioned from rural utility to suburban consumption.
And the American Kennel Club, the AKC, was really at the center of turning that desire into an industry. Before this, they were mostly a niche organization for wealthy hobbyists and the show dog elite, right?
They were. But as suburban families sat around watching television shows like Lassie or The Adventures of Rin Tin Tin, they didn't just want any dog. They wanted a purebred collie. They wanted a German Shepherd. They wanted a Cocker Spaniel.
Consumer demand for specific, recognizable breeds skyrocketed to a level that traditional small-scale breeders just couldn't possibly meet.
So the market responded the way the market always does, which is mass production.
Exactly. This era gave birth to the commercial breeding industry, heavily concentrated in Midwestern states like Missouri, which animal welfare advocates later dubbed the puppy mill. These were high-volume, low-overhead agricultural operations. They were designed to just churn out puppies to fill the window displays of new pet store chains popping up in suburban malls across the entire country.
So you have this massive unregulated supply chain pumping millions of puppies into the suburbs. Fast forward a few years, those puppies grow up, they aren't spayed or neutered, they have litters of their own, and the inevitable downstream result is that shelter intake numbers absolutely explode.
Which is why, by the 1970s, the animal welfare movement finally realizes they are drowning. They organized these national conferences in 1974 and 1976 and officially named the crisis pet overpopulation. And they developed a strategic framework that became known by the acronym LES, Legislation, Education, and Sterilization.
Sterilization being the absolute key there. It's wild to think about now, but routine, low-cost spaying and neutering just wasn't a normalized part of American culture before this. It was a massive behavioral engineering project. They literally had to convince millions of people to surgically alter their pets.
They absolutely did. They had to overcome tremendous economic barriers, setting up subsidized clinics, while simultaneously overcoming deeply entrenched attitudinal barriers. People thought it was unnatural, or they believed that a female dog needed to have one litter to calm down, which the reading points out is a total biological myth.
It became this huge cultural push. I mean, you had Bob Barker signing off every single episode of The Price is Right, looking directly into the camera and telling daytime television audiences, help control the pet population, have your pets spayed or neutered. It permeated the culture.
It really did.
But here is the massive flaw in that era's thinking, as the source text highlights. As much as that campaign worked to lower the astronomical birth rates, treating mass euthanasia as a mercy for the dogs already in the system is just entirely backwards. It is like walking into a bathroom and seeing an overflowing bathtub ruining the floors. And instead of just reaching over and turning off the faucet, you decide the most compassionate solution is to spend 30 years frantically mopping the tile.
That analogy perfectly captures the frustration of the late 20th century. The first wave of humane education mopped the floor effectively in certain rooms. Middle-class, suburban, predominantly white communities on the coasts and in the north adopted spay-neuter practices rapidly.
Right, they turned the faucet down.
But the campaign had virtually no traction in lower-income communities, particularly in the rural South. The economic realities and cultural logic that sustained backyard breeding in those areas were left completely untouched. The faucet in those communities was still running wide open, and the shelters were still drowning the overflow.
Okay, so if we are stuck in this cycle of frantic mopping and 20 million dead animals, how do we ever arrive at today's cultural expectation? Because right now, if a healthy dog goes into a shelter, you and I and the listener all implicitly expect that dog to be saved. How did that paradigm shift actually happen?
The shift begins in San Francisco in the late 1970s with a man named Richard Avanzino. In 1976, he took over the San Francisco SPCA and did something that was considered dangerously radical by the old guard of animal welfare. He systematically dismantled the institutional logic of routine euthanasia.
He inverted the entire philosophy. For decades, shelters looked at the public as the enemy, the irresponsible masses who breed unwanted animals and dump them at the pound for the shelter staff to dispose of. But Avanzino looked out at the community and saw an asset.
That was his genius. He realized you cannot solve a community problem behind closed shelter doors. He launched massive volunteer foster networks. He expanded off-site adoption programs into high-traffic retail areas. He instituted behavioral and medical rehabilitation for sick or fearful animals that previously would have been euthanized upon intake without a second thought.
His revolutionary premise was actually quite simple. Any animal that was not irremediably suffering or genuinely dangerous to the public was a candidate for adoption.
And he proved it wasn't just some utopian fantasy. By 1994, San Francisco had virtually eliminated the euthanasia of healthy, treatable animals. And they did it in one of the most expensive, densely populated urban environments in the country.
Which is incredible.
It is. That success proved it was an organizational and philosophical transformation, not just a matter of having unlimited space or unlimited funding. And from Avanzino's groundwork in San Francisco, the modern national no-kill movement was born.
Which brings us to Nathan Winograd, who actually worked under Avanzino. Winograd takes this philosophy national, but he does something incredibly strategic. He introduces a metric, the 90% threshold.
The 90% threshold is a fascinating piece of strategy because it is fundamentally a political achievement disguised as a mathematical one. The rule dictates that a shelter can officially claim the coveted no-kill status if it saves 90% or more of the animals that enter its care.
Okay, and what about the other 10%?
The remaining 10% allowance is an acknowledgement of reality. It accounts for animals that are genuinely, irremediably suffering from illness or are so behaviorally damaged they pose an active threat to public safety.
I can definitely see why that's a powerful tool. Before this, a shelter director could euthanize 60% of their dogs, shrug their shoulders, and say, hey, we're doing the best we can with what we have. But once Winograd establishes this hard 90% metric, advocates suddenly have a weapon.
Exactly. You can track the data, you can publish public rankings, you can organize angry constituents at city council meetings and point to a neighboring county saving 92% while your county is only saving 50%. It created real, tangible, reputational, and political costs for shelter directors who refused to modernize their operations.
Okay, I have to stop you right there, because as someone looking at this from the outside, that math feels incredibly suspicious to me. A shelter's save rate is just a basic fraction, right?
Yeah.
Animals saved divided by total animals taken in.
Correct.
So let's say I'm a shelter director. I take in 10,000 animals this year, and I euthanize 2,000 of them because I don't have space. My save rate is 80%. The community is angry at me. I'm failing the metric. But what if, next year, I just tell my staff to stop accepting difficult dogs? Someone brings in an old dog or a large breed dog, and we just say, sorry, we are at capacity. We are only accepting highly adoptable small dogs right now.
Yeah.
If I artificially restrict my intake down to 5,000 animals and I only euthanize 400 of them, suddenly my save rate shoots up to 92%.
The math checks out.
Yeah, I get the golden no-kill label, the mayor praises me, and I get a bonus. But the large dog I turned away is still suffering on the street.
Aren't you basically incentivizing shelters to abandon the animals that need them the most?
You have just articulated the central vulnerability of the entire no-kill metric. In the industry, critics refer to this as laundering the euthanasia rate. The deaths are moved off the municipal shelter's ledger, so the spreadsheet looks fantastic, but the suffering still happens out in the community.
It's just an accounting trick. It definitely can be. When a shelter turns away an unwanted animal, that animal doesn't magically vanish into a loving home. It might survive as a stray, breeding and creating an even larger intake crisis for the following year. Or worse, it might suffer and die from exposure, starvation, or disease, hit by a car on the highway without even the mediating intervention of a humane euthanasia. The shelter achieves its political victory, but the animal's reality is arguably much worse.
But the no-kill advocates must have an answer for this. They can't just be ignoring the dogs turned away at the door.
Their defense is that managed intake, which is their term for restricting admissions, is not a trick if it is paired with robust community support programs. They argue that if someone comes to surrender a dog because it keeps chewing the drywall, the shelter shouldn't just take the dog and kill it. The shelter should provide the owner with free behavioral training or a free crate to solve the root cause so the dog stays in its original home.
And that sounds great in theory. If a jurisdiction has the money to fund massive surrender prevention counseling, then managed intake makes total sense.
But that's the catch. A restricted intake shelter operating in a severely under-resourced community that doesn't have those safety nets is not addressing root causes at all. It is simply locking the door and looking the other way.
Which leads to an even darker loophole discussed in the reading. Let's talk about the Aslomar Accords. In 2004, a bunch of national animal welfare organizations met in Asilomar, California, to try and standardize how data was collected across the country. Because until then, everyone was using completely different terminology.
The intention behind Asilomar was noble. You cannot diagnose a national crisis or debate policy without consistent baseline data. So they created standardized categories for animal health upon intake: healthy, treatable, and unhealthy and untreatable.
But by creating that unhealthy and untreatable category, they accidentally created a massive escape hatch for shelters desperate to protect their 90% save rate, didn't they?
Yes, they did, because the definition of unhealthy and untreatable proved to be incredibly subjective and flexible. Let me give you a concrete example from the text. Suppose a dog comes into a busy, loud shelter. It is perfectly healthy, but it is terrified of the noise, so when a volunteer reaches into its kennel while it's eating, the dog growls and snaps to protect its food bowl. It's called resource guarding. It is a highly treatable behavioral quirk with a little bit of training in a quiet foster home.
But if the shelter doesn't have the staff or the foster homes to do that training.
Exactly. The shelter can legally categorize that dog as untreatable due to behavioral risk. They euthanize the dog, and because the dog was classified as untreatable, that death does not count against their 90% no-kill metric.
Wow.
Yeah. If a dog has a minor bite history, even if a child was pulling its ears and provoked it, the shelter can label it dangerous. Shelters can protect their no-kid status by simply expanding their definition of what is irreparably broken.
So if 90% of animals are allegedly being saved, and we know the math is somewhat pliable, we have to ask who makes up the remaining 10%. Who are the dogs actually falling through these loopholes and ending up on the euthanasia table?
When you look at the demographic breakdown of that remaining 10% in high-intake shelters, you are led directly to the most intensely debated, deeply misunderstood, and legally fraught animal in the American shelter system: the dogs that fall under the umbrella term of pit bull.
Let's start with the most mind-bending fact about this. The pit bull is a biological fiction. It is not an actual breed recognized by the American Kennel Club. There's the American Pit Bull Terrier, the American Staffordshire Terrier, and a few others. But pit bull, as it is used in shelters and city ordinances, is just a colloquial visual category.
That is precisely the definitional crisis. When a shelter worker or an animal control officer writes pit bull on an intake form, they are not relying on a pedigree. They are looking at a visual phenotype: a blocky head, a muscular build, a short coat, a wide jaw. And the scientific data proves that human beings, even highly trained professionals, are shockingly bad at identifying breed by sight alone.
You're talking about the 2013 study published in the Veterinary Journal, right?
Yes. It is one of the most highly cited studies in this field. Researchers took shelter workers, adoption counselors, and veterinarians, people who handle dogs for a living, and asked them to visually assign breed labels to a large sample of shelter dogs. Then the researchers tested the DNA of those exact same dogs.
And the results were just a complete disaster for the visual identification method.
The professionals' visual guesses were barely better than a random coin flip. Dogs that were confidently visually identified as pit bulls by shelter staff frequently had absolutely zero terrier ancestry in their DNA. They were mixes of boxers, mastiffs, labs, bulldogs, completely unrelated breeds that just happened to combine genetically to produce a blocky head.
That's crazy.
Conversely, dogs that did have significant Staffordshire or Pit Bull Terrier DNA were frequently visually identified as entirely different breeds, like Labrador mixes, simply because they lacked the stereotypical broad jaw.
Think about the implications of that for a second. It is exactly like a police department relying on deeply biased, historically flawed facial recognition software to hand down a legal death sentence. The software, in this case, the shelter worker's eyes, looks at a blocky head in a short coat, flags it as a threat, and signs the paperwork. A dog's entire trajectory, whether it gets adopted or euthanized, is dictated by a visual guess that science proves is fundamentally unreliable.
And that visual guess doesn't just dictate shelter outcomes. It drives actual public safety policy at the municipal and county level across the entire country. This brings us to breed-specific legislation, commonly known as BSL.
Right. BSL refers to laws that regulate, restrict, or outright prohibit the ownership of specific dog breeds within a city's limits. And while it occasionally targets breeds like Rottweilers or Dobermans, it is overwhelmingly aimed at pit bull-type dogs.
In jurisdictions with the strictest forms of BSL, ownership is banned entirely. That means if an animal control officer seizes a dog that simply looks like it meets the physical criteria of a restricted breed, that dog must be legally confiscated. And in many cases, it must be euthanized by law, regardless of its individual temperament, its socialization, or its history.
A perfectly gentle family dog with no history of aggression can be seized and killed simply because it possesses the wrong geometry of its skull and the wrong zip code.
Exactly. Now, when we look at this debate, the scientific and professional consensus is heavily stacked against BSL.
Overwhelmingly so, according to the source material.
Yes. The American Veterinary Medical Association, the National Canine Research Council, the CDC, and virtually every professional behavioral organization opposes breed-specific bans. Their argument rests on three pillars. First, as we just discussed, the visual identification is inherently flawed, making the laws arbitrary to enforce. Second, the policy targets a visual aesthetic rather than individual behavior, which violates basic principles of behavioral science.
And third, the data shows these bans simply don't work to keep the public safer.
Exactly. Comprehensive studies show that serious dog bite rates in a community are much better predicted by human factors. The prevalence of intact, unneutered male dogs, the number of dogs kept chained or tethered in yards, the socioeconomic conditions of the neighborhood, and the reckless behavior of individual owners. A major 2012 peer-reviewed study in the Journal of Veterinary Behavior confirmed that assessing an individual dog's observable behavior is vastly more predictive of bite risk than whatever breed label a human has assigned to it.
They mentioned the Netherlands in the text, too.
Right, look at the Netherlands. They enacted a strict national pit bull ban in 1993, enforced it for 15 years, and ultimately repealed it in 2008 because they found absolutely no statistical reduction in dog bites. It was just a failed experiment.
But we have to look at the other side of this. The city council members passing these laws aren't just acting out of cartoonish malice. They are operating from a place of intense precautionary reasoning.
And it is crucial to understand their logic. The strongest argument for BSL isn't necessarily a claim that breed is absolute destiny or that every pit bull is inherently vicious. Rather, it is an argument about the capacity for catastrophic harm.
Right. They argue that certain breeds were historically selected by humans over generations for specific physical and behavioral traits, gameness, tremendous jaw strength, a high threshold for pain.
Let's define gameness because it's highly misunderstood in the general public. Gameness doesn't mean aggression. Gameness is a trait bred into terriers to ensure they will persist in completing a task, even in the face of severe physical exhaustion or injury. In a rat-catching terrier, that's useful. In a dog-fighting scenario, it is devastating. So, proponents of BSL argue that while a pit bull might not bite any more frequently than a golden retriever or a chihuahua, when a pit bull does bite, its physical capacity and its tenacity mean the resulting injury is exponentially more severe.
And they point to hospital emergency room data for that.
They do. ER data consistently indicates that while dogs identified as pit bulls may not cause the absolute majority of all dog bites, they are massively disproportionately represented in the rare incidents that result in reconstructive surgery, severe disfigurement, or death, particularly incidents involving young children or the elderly.
So if you are a mayor and you have just spoken to a parent whose toddler was mauled in a public park, You aren't looking at a national regression analysis of bait statistics. You are looking at a visceral, irreversible community tragedy. You are applying the precautionary principle. You are arguing that waiting for a large, physically powerful dog to demonstrate dangerousness first means you are essentially waiting for a child to be injured before you act.
It is a precautionary regulation based on a category of risk, similar to how municipalities regulate the ownership of exotic animals or hazardous materials. But you have to return to the reality for the shelter system. The consequences of BSL for shelters are absolute and devastating. In a jurisdiction with a ban, no amount of no-kill advocacy, no amount of behavioral rehabilitation, no amount of open kennel space can save a dog that meets the visual criteria of the ban. The euthanasia is mandated by law.
What makes this entire debate so jarring is the intense cultural whiplash these dogs have experienced. The very same visual category of animal, the blocky-headed, muscular dog, has been simultaneously the most beloved, iconic family pet in America and its most deeply feared pariah.
The historical reversal is really fascinating. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, pit bull-type dogs were incredibly popular family companions. And there is a specific biological reason for this that gets entirely lost in modern debates. Yes, these dogs were originally bred for blood sports and the fighting rings, but in those rings, human handlers needed to be able to reach into the pit, grab two highly aroused fighting dogs, and physically separate them without getting bitten themselves.
That is a critical detail.
It is the most important detail. Any fighting dog that redirected its aggression and bit a human handler was immediately culled from the gene pool. It was destroyed. So perversely, the dog-fighting syndicates were ruthlessly, selectively breeding for profound human sociability and human deference. The intense human friendliness of the pit bull is not a modern myth invented by rescue groups. It was a historically selected, deeply ingrained genetic trait.
And you see that sociability reflected everywhere in the cultural touchstones of early 20th century America. You had Sergeant Stubby, a stray pit bull-type dog who wandered onto a military encampment, shipped out with the 102nd Infantry in World War I, survived mustard gas and shrapnel, and became a highly decorated, nationally celebrated war hero.
Exactly.
You had Pete the Pup, the famous dog with a painted ring around his eye from the Little Rascals in our gang films, surrounded by chaotic children. They were literally used on military recruitment posters to symbolize American loyalty, resilience, and toughness.
So how do we get from Pete the Pup to the modern stigma? The transformation happened gradually, but it accelerated violently in the 1970s and 1980s. It was driven by a resurgence of underground dogfighting, the rise of the illegal drug trade, and the media's association of these dogs with urban gang culture. Drug dealers began using them as cheap, intimidating security. And it is crucial to understand behavioral biology here. Dogfighting selects strictly for interdog aggression, not human aggression. But the general public does not grasp that nuance.
Of course not. If you see a snarling dog chained to a fence guarding a drug house on the evening news every night, you naturally assume the dog is a threat to you.
Exactly. The dogs essentially absorbed the reputation of the criminal activities they were forced to participate in, and they acquired the cultural stigma of the poverty and urban environments they were associated with. They became a symbol of urban decay.
Which brings us to the year 2007, and a true watershed moment in American animal welfare, outlined in the reading The Michael Vick Case.
The Vick case changed everything. Michael Vick, a superstar NFL quarterback, pleaded guilty to federal felony charges for operating a massive, gruesome dogfighting ring called Bad News Kennels on his property in Virginia. Roughly 50 pit bull-type dogs were seized by federal authorities. Now, at the time, the absolute standard operating procedure endorsed even by major animal welfare groups like PETA was that fighting dogs were categorically unrehabilitatable. They were considered ticking time bombs that had to be destroyed for public safety.
The assumption was just that the trauma and the breeding were too deep. But a coalition of behavioral experts and rescue organizations stepped in and aggressively demanded the right to evaluate the Vick dogs individually, one by one.
And what they discovered systematically overturned decades of entrenched assumptions. These were dogs that had lived through the absolute worst, most violent, psychologically torturous conditions imaginable. Yet the overwhelming majority of them were safely rehabilitated. They didn't just survive, they thrived. Many of the Vick dogs went on to become certified, registered therapy animals, visiting children in hospitals. They became beloved family pets, sleeping on couches.
It proved, in the most highly publicized way possible, the massive, heartbreaking gap between the breed's terrifying public reputation and the actual behavioral reality of the individual animal.
Yet, despite that definitive proof, the stigma remains incredibly sticky. Today, pit bull-type dogs still make up 30 to 50% of the population in many high-intake urban shelters. And in some southern cities, they represent over 60% of the dogs sitting behind bars.
Which perfectly transitions us into the geography of this crisis, because the surplus of animals isn't distributed evenly across the country. Where exactly are all these unwanted dogs, and how is the system attempting to move them around?
To understand the modern shelter system, you have to look at the massive north-south divide. It is two entirely different realities. On one hand, you have states in the Northeast, like New York, Massachusetts, and Connecticut, and states in the Pacific Northwest, like Washington and Oregon. Over the last 40 years, these areas invested heavily in municipal animal control infrastructure. They achieved incredibly high spay-neuter compliance rates. And crucially, they have enormous cultural and economic demand for adoption.
The result is that their municipal shelters are frequently empty, or they only house a small population of dogs with severe, expensive medical needs or difficult behavioral complications. If you want to adopt a healthy puppy in Boston, you might be put on a 6-month waiting list.
But then you look at the South, states like Texas, Mississippi, Louisiana, Alabama, Georgia. These states consistently report the highest per capita rates of shelter intake and shelter euthanasia in the entire country. Mississippi, for instance, has repeatedly posted the highest shelter kill rate in the nation.
Why is the disparity so massive?
It is systemic. You have lower spay-neuter rates driven by widespread veterinary deserts and economic poverty. You have warmer climates that allow for year-round breeding cycles for feral populations. You have larger populations of free-roaming, unowned dogs in rural areas. And you have severely under-resourced, underfunded municipal animal control agencies that simply cannot keep up with the biological math of unchecked reproduction.
So you have this massive geographic mismatch, an intense shortage of highly adoptable dogs in the north, and a catastrophic lethal surplus of dogs in the south. Nature abhors a vacuum, and markets abhor an imbalance. This mismatch has birthed an entire logistics network that most people don't even know exists, the rescue transport economy.
The scale of it is staggering. We are talking about an estimated 350,000 to over 500,000 dogs being moved across state lines every single year. It is one of the largest unregulated movements of domestic animals in the world.
And it doesn't operate like FedEx or UPS. It operates on a surprisingly ad hoc grassroots infrastructure.
It runs on Facebook groups, Instagram posts, and sheer human willpower. The mechanism works like this. A desperate shelter worker in a rural Mississippi pound takes a photo of a dog whose time is up on Friday. They post it to a rescue network page. A private, nonprofit rescue organization sitting in a suburb of Boston sees the photo and pulls the dog, claiming legal ownership. Then a massive relay system is activated.
The relay system is fascinating. It's really just ordinary people.
It is. A network of volunteer drivers, often retirees or animal lovers, will sign up for 2-hour driving legs. They meet in Walmart parking lots off the interstate, transfer the dog from one personal SUV to another, and move the animal leg by leg 1,000 miles up the coast. Once the dog arrives in New England, the Northern Rescue handles any necessary medical processing, places the dog in a temporary foster home, and then adopts it out to a local family for a fee, usually ranging from $200 to $600 to cover the transport and medical costs.
It sounds like a beautiful cooperative triumph. But because it functions like a supply and demand market, it is governed by brutal market dynamics.
And those dynamics have a dark side. Northern rescues are operating under intense pressure to move dogs quickly so they can free up foster homes for the next transport. To do that, they have to import dogs that their local adopters actually want to buy. So they cherry-pick the supply.
Right. If you are a rescue director in Connecticut scrolling through photos of dogs in a Texas shelter, you are looking for the highly liquid assets. You quickly pull the cute 8-week-old puppies, you pull the purebred golden retrievers, you pull the popular designer mixes, the labradoodles, you pull the small, fluffy lap dogs.
And who do they leave behind in the Texas shelter?
They leave behind the 50-pound mixed breed adult dogs. They leave the older dogs with arthritis. And overwhelmingly, they leave behind the pit bull type dogs.
This creates a devastating paradox for the southern municipal shelters. The transport network swoops in and completely removes the most highly adoptable inventory, the very dogs that the southern shelter might have actually been able to adopt out locally to families in their own town to generate revenue and positive foot traffic.
Wow. So they're taking the easiest cases.
Exactly. The transport skims the cream off the top, leaving the southern shelter populated exclusively with the hardest to place, highest risk animals. In some documented cases, the euthanasia rate for the dogs left behind in the source shelter actually increases as a direct result of the transport network removing all the highly adoptable animals.
It's basically an extraction economy.
Mm.
But there is an even bigger, more baffling paradox embedded in this system. If our southern shelters are overflowing and we are euthanizing hundreds of thousands of dogs domestically, why on earth is the United States importing tens of thousands of rescue dogs from overseas every year?
It is one of the most contentious issues in animal welfare today. The U.S. has become a massive importer of rescue dogs from places like South Korea, China, Romania, Puerto Rico, and various Latin American countries.
I just can't square the logic. Why would an adopter in Massachusetts pay a premium to fly a dog in from a street in Bulgaria when there is a perfectly good dog about to be euthanized in North Carolina?
The answer lies entirely on the psychology of the demand side. Adopters are profoundly driven by narrative. An international rescue story saying you saved a dog from a meat farm in South Korea or rescued a street dog from the ruins of a natural disaster in another country is emotionally compelling and socially validating in a way that a generic domestic stray story often isn't. It carries a unique cultural cachet.
So it's about the story you get to tell.
That's a huge part of it. Furthermore, adopters want very specific breed types or sizes, like small, hypoallergenic dogs that might be easier for a rescue to source in bulk from an international partner than to hunt down domestically in a saturated market.
But this isn't just an absurdity of consumer preference. Moving thousands of dogs across international borders with minimal oversight has terrifying biosecurity implications.
Absolutely. The scale of this international importation grew so rapidly, and the accompanying veterinary documentation was frequently so fraudulent or inadequate that it triggered a massive public health response. In 2021, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the CDC, had to step in and impose a sweeping temporary suspension on the importation of dogs from more than 100 countries.
They weren't doing that for animal welfare reasons, they were doing it for human health reasons.
Correct. The CDC was explicitly concerned about the risk of reintroducing canine rabies into the United States, a disease we had successfully eliminated from our domestic dog population decades ago. Dogs were arriving at JFK Airport with fake rabies vaccination certificates. It highlighted just how reckless and inadequate the oversight mechanisms were for an informal rescue economy operating on an international scale.
All of this, the overflowing shelters, the cherry-picking transport networks, the international imports, the frantic search for a specific type of puppy, it points to the most fundamental premise of this entire discussion. Animals do not abandon themselves. They don't fail to spay and neuter themselves. They don't swipe credit cards and impulse buy themselves in pet stores. This isn't an animal crisis. It is a human crisis. How do human economics and human culture manufacture this surplus?
We have to look at the structural drivers, and housing policy is perhaps the single most significant and consistently underappreciated factor in the entire equation.
A huge percentage of the dogs entering shelters aren't feral strays picked up off the street. They are owner surrenders. Someone walking through the front door crying, handing over a leash.
A quarter to a third of all shelter intakes in a typical year are owner relinquishments. And when you dive into the data from large urban shelters and survey those owners, housing instability is almost universally the primary driver.
People are literally being forced to choose between homelessness and their pets.
Exactly. When working-class families face eviction, or when they are forced to move because of rent hikes, they enter a rental market that is profoundly hostile to pet ownership. Landlords refuse to accept pets entirely, or they enforce strict weight limits, say, no dogs over 25 pounds, which instantly eliminates half the shelter population. Or they charge exorbitant, non-refundable pet deposits and monthly pet rent fees that a family on the brink of eviction simply cannot afford.
So the argument is that housing policy is animal policy. If you want to empty the shelters, you have to advocate for housing affordability, tenant protections, and laws that prevent landlords from enforcing arbitrary breed bans or extortive pet fees.
It is the most direct lever you can pull to reduce shelter intake. Keep the dog in the home it already has. The second major human factor is the structural failure of the spay-neuter campaign to reach the communities that actually need it most.
We talked earlier about how successful that campaign was in the middle-class suburbs, but it hit a hard ceiling.
The ceiling is defined by economics and culture. In affluent urban areas on the coasts, spay-neuter compliance rates are above 90%. The intake crisis is not being driven by irresponsible dog owners in Cambridge, Massachusetts, or Palo Alto, California. The crisis is driven by geographic areas where access to low-cost veterinary care is virtually non-existent. These are called veterinary deserts. If a routine spay surgery costs between $200 and $600 at a private clinic, and you live in a rural community living below the poverty line, your dog is going to reproduce. It is a simple economic inevitability.
But it's not just about the money, is it? There is a massive cultural barrier that national advocacy groups from New York or D.C. rarely talk about openly because they don't know how to address it. It's the association of intact male dogs with specific norms of masculinity.
This is a crucial, deeply embedded sociological truth that often gets glossed over. In many rural and working-class communities, particularly in the South and parts of the Midwest, an unneutered, intact male dog is culturally viewed as a marker of masculinity and virility. The intact dog is perceived as more natural, physically tougher, and a better protector of the property. The act of castration is viewed with visceral discomfort.
So when a national animal welfare organization parachutes into one of these towns with a clinical, sterile public health message about population control, they are completely failing to engage with the actual cultural logic on the ground.
They are speaking a foreign language. To the owner, the procedure feels socially stigmatizing. It feels like emasculating their animal. The only spay-neuter campaigns that actually succeed in these specific demographics are those led by trusted local figures, a local hunter, a local veterinarian, a faith leader who can frame the procedure not as a moral lecture from an outsider, but as a practical tool for improving the dog's health and focus.
And while we are struggling to manage the dogs we already have in the system, the American pet industry is actively, aggressively manufacturing more of them. We are talking about a $158 billion industry, and a significant portion of that economy is structured to systematically encourage impulse purchasing.
The commerce of cuteness is an incredibly powerful economic force. Now, many progressive municipalities and states have banned the retail sale of commercially bred puppies in pet stores, effectively forcing those stores to host shelter adoption events instead. But traditional pet stores still exist in many states, and they are architecturally and psychologically optimized for impulse conversion.
Think about the last time you walked past a pet store window in a mall, or even just scrolled past a video of an 8-week-old golden retriever puppy on your phone. You get that immediate, profound dopamine rush, right? The industry weaponizes that biological response.
An inexperienced buyer is hit with that dopamine rush. They walk into the store, they hold the puppy, and they make a $1,000 purchase on a credit card. At that moment of transaction, there is zero logical contemplation of the 15-year commitment. There is no calculation of the thousands of dollars in future veterinary costs, the time required for behavioral training, or the energy levels of the large adult dog that the tiny puppy will rapidly become.
And online marketplaces have put that dopamine hit directly into our pockets. It is an endless, frictionless scroll of puppies.
Okay.
It is structurally identical to the psychology of an online gambling app. You see a picture, you feel the rush, you click a checkout button, and a puppy is shipped to you. And 18 months later, when that cute puppy is a 70-pound, energetic, wildly undertrained adult dog tearing up the living room couch, the family realizes they can't handle it, and that dog ends up surrendered to the municipal shelter.
Which brings us directly to the source of all those puppies, the commercial breeding industry. There has been a significant ongoing political battle over how to regulate this sector, specifically regarding a piece of federal legislation known as the Puppy Protection Act.
What does that act actually try to do?
The legislation aims to amend the existing Federal Animal Welfare Act to impose new, stricter baseline requirements on USDA-licensed commercial dog breeders. We are talking about basic quality of life mandates, minimum cage sizes based on the dog's height, mandatory daily socialization time outside of the cage, limits on how many litters a single female dog can produce in her lifetime, and requiring that retired breeding dogs be actively placed in adoptive homes rather than simply sold at auction or euthanized.
The major animal welfare groups like the ASPCA and the Humane Society Legislative Fund obviously support this. They view it as a completely necessary, humane floor for commercial agricultural operations that treat dogs like livestock. But the American Kennel Club, the AKC, opposes it. Now, at first glance, if the AKC is an organization for dog lovers, why would they oppose a law mandating larger cages and playtime? Walk me through their actual argument.
The AKC's counterargument is fundamentally about the mechanics of federal regulation. They argue that the legislation applies arbitrary, one-size-fits-all federal mandates that cannot possibly account for the vast physical and behavioral differences across hundreds of dog breeds.
Yeah.
A cage size or a temperature requirement that makes sense for a husky might be dangerous for a chihuahua.
Okay, that's a logistical argument. I get that.
Sure. But their deeper objection is about scope. They argue the bill's definition of a covered breeder is dangerously broad. They fear it will sweep in small-scale, responsible hobby breeders, someone who might only have 2 or 3 intact female dogs living inside their actual home, and burden them with expensive commercial-grade regulations and USDA inspections that are meant for massive 100-dog operations. They argue it will drive the good, small-scale breeders out of existence.
It is a legitimate debate over whether clumsy federal standard setting can accurately target the bad actors without accidentally punishing the responsible ones. But the practical, on-the-ground result of this legislative gridlock is that the high-volume commercial breeding sector, the faucet pumping out puppies that directly feeds the shelter crisis down the line, remains shielded from these updated baseline federal standards.
And all of these fragile, broken systems we just discussed, the housing crisis forcing surrenders, the lack of veterinary access, the impulse buying driven by dopamine, the unchecked commercial breeding, the geographical mismatch, they were all humming along, barely holding together with duct tape.
And then, the most disruptive event of the 21st century slammed into the system.
The COVID-19 pandemic. It completely upended the landscape and tested the fundamental narrative of the entire animal shelter movement.
Let's start with the unbelievable boom of 2020. The lockdowns happen. Everyone is trapped at home, isolated, lonely, staring at their walls. And suddenly, everyone wanted a pet. The ASPCA estimated that nearly 23 million American homes acquired a pet during the pandemic. For the first time in modern history, shelters across the country literally emptied out. People were adopting the old dogs, the medical cases, the pit bulls. It felt like a miracle.
It did feel like a miracle, but that rapid emptying gave rise to a highly pervasive media narrative that proved to be dangerously simplistic and frankly false. The myth of the dumped pandemic puppy.
I remember this vividly. The story was that all these selfish remote workers adopted dogs on a whim to keep them company, and then in 2022, as soon as their bosses recalled them to the office, they callously dumped those same dogs back at the shelter because they didn't have time to walk them anymore.
Right. It was a highly moralistic, deeply satisfying story because it allowed us to blame individual human selfishness. But when you look at the data, when researchers actually tracked the microchips and the intake forms, it was substantially false. The vast majority of people who adopted during the pandemic kept their pets. The retention rate was actually remarkably high.
So when the bust arrived in 2022 and 2023, and shelters were suddenly facing the absolute worst overcrowding crisis in a generation, with euthanasia numbers spiking dramatically, what was actually driving it? If it wasn't the dumped pandemic puppies, what was it?
It was a catastrophic convergence of 3 structural pressures. First, we have to look at the biological math of the lockdowns. During the initial wave of COVID, veterinary clinics were mandated to suspend all non-emergency procedures to conserve PPE and medical supplies. That meant spay and neuter surgeries were halted for months.
Oh, wow.
One major study estimated a deficit of 2.7 million missed spay-neuter surgeries by the end of 2021.
Think about the biological cascade of that. One unspayed female dog has a litter of 6 puppies in late 2020. By late 2021, those 6 puppies are now adults, and they're out having litters of 6. It is exponential growth. That massive gap in surgeries fed directly into a tidal wave of stray populations hitting the streets 18 months later.
Exactly. The second pressure was economic. The pandemic-era eviction moratoriums and the stimulus checks eventually ended, and they ended right at the exact moment that massive inflation and housing costs skyrocketed. So housing instability, which we established as the primary driver of owner surrenders, came roaring back to the forefront. Third, the sheer cost of owning a dog exploded. The price of commercial dog food and routine veterinary care surged, forcing working-class owners into the heartbreaking position of literally choosing between feeding their children and feeding their pets.
And fourth, we can't forget the backyard breeders. They watched the massive adoption boom of 2020. They saw people willing to pay $2,000 for a poorly bred doodle mix because the shelters were empty. So they bred their dogs repeatedly to cash in. But by 2022, the demand had evaporated, the economy was tightening, and these breeders were stuck with massive litters they couldn't sell. So they dumped them at the municipal shelters.
All of these massive macroeconomic forces crashed down simultaneously onto a shelter system that was already buckling under the weight of a horrific, invisible workforce toll.
We really have to talk about the human cost of this crisis, because shelters are not run by robots. They are run by human beings who are absorbing the trauma of a broken society. The academic literature refers to it as the caring-killing paradox.
It is a devastating psychological environment. A shelter worker, a kennel technician, enters this low-paying field for one reason. They possess a profound love and empathy for animals, and they quickly find themselves trapped in a job where they might arrive at 8 a.m., feed a dog, play with it in the yard, teach it how to sit, and comfort it when it's terrified of the noise. And then, at 3 p.m. that exact same afternoon, a transport van arrives with 20 stray dogs. There are no empty cages. The manager looks at the spreadsheet, and that same technician is ordered to walk the dog they just played with down the hall and hold it while it is euthanized, simply because of geometry.
It is so crucial for people to understand this distinction. It is not a private practice veterinarian putting a 15-year-old cancer-ridden dog to sleep in a quiet room with a crying family to end its physical suffering. It is a 22-year-old technician ending the life of a perfectly healthy 2-year-old dog purely for logistical reasons, and doing it over and over and over again 50 times a week.
The psychological damage of that paradox is profound. A 2023 academic survey of the industry found that over 90% of shelter staff scored in the high-risk range for secondary traumatic stress. They are absorbing trauma daily. And unlike a human medical patient who can verbally reassure a burnt-out nurse or a child who can thank a social worker, an animal cannot articulate its needs, nor can it validate the caregiver. The dog just looks at you.
It leads to massive compassion fatigue. The turnover rates in these municipal shelters are astronomical. And this mental health crisis doesn't stop at the shelter door. It extends to the entire veterinary profession, doesn't it?
It does. The CDC has extensively documented a severe, elevated risk of suicide among veterinarians and veterinary technicians compared to the general American population. The compounding stress of euthanizing animals combined with the emotional abuse they frequently receive from angry clients who cannot afford life-saving care creates a toxic, lethal professional environment.
It's a vicious cycle that eats itself alive. The overcrowding burns out the staff. The traumatized staff quits. The shelter becomes severely understaffed. Because they are understaffed, they can process fewer adoptions and manage fewer foster networks, which worsens the overcrowding, which forces them to euthanize even more animals, which traumatizes the remaining staff even further until they break.
So with the system buckling, where do we go from here? Both practically, in terms of tactics, and philosophically, in terms of how we view our relationship with these animals.
Let's start with the practical, and specifically the raging debate over cats. We've talked mostly about dogs, but there are an estimated 30 to 80 million community or feral cats roaming the United States. Historically, the municipal animal control response was simple and brutal. Trap them, bring them to the pound, and euthanize them.
But the modern, highly debated alternative is TNR, trap, neuter, return.
Right. The concept is that you set a humane trap, you catch the feral cat, you take it to a clinic to be spayed or neutered and vaccinated against rabies, and then, crucially, you return it back to the exact alley or farm where you found it so it can live out its life without reproducing.
Now, cat welfare advocates passionately point to the success of these programs. In cities like Albuquerque, aggressive TNR programs, combined with policies that return healthy shelter cats to their outdoor territories rather than adopting them out, reduced feline euthanasia rates in the municipal shelter by over 80%. They argue that if you neuter the cats, the colonies eventually stabilize, the nuisance behaviors like yowling and fighting stop, and the population declines over time through natural attrition.
However, we have to look at the fierce opposition to TNR. Ornithological organizations, conservationists, and groups like the American Bird Conservancy strongly, vehemently oppose returning cats to the environment.
And they present massive, peer-reviewed ecological data to support their opposition. Studies estimate that free-roaming domestic cats are a catastrophic invasive species, killing between 1.3 and 4 billion birds, and up to 22 billion small mammals annually in the United States alone. They are directly linked to the extinction of multiple bird and small mammal species globally. The conservationists view TNR not as a humane solution, but as a policy that sustains a massive, subsidized ecological threat.
It is a fascinating clash of moral frameworks. The shelter worker looks at the cat in the cage and says, "It is morally unacceptable to euthanize this individual healthy animal. I must return it to the field." The conservationist looks at the exact same cat and says, If you return it to the field, you're condemning hundreds of native birds to a violent death. Euthanizing the invasive predator is the moral choice. It is a complex, agonizing empirical question that local, underfunded shelters are left to navigate almost always without the resources to properly assess the broader environmental impact of their decisions.
Moving beyond the feline debate, the most promising practical shift we are seeing in the dog world is a move toward community resilience programs. For 100 years, the animal welfare model was reactive, wait for the animal to be surrendered to the shelter, and then try to find it a new home. The modern shift is proactive. Move the intervention into the community to prevent the animal from ever entering the shelter in the first place.
Right, fixing the faucet instead of mopping the floor.
Exactly. This looks like surrender prevention hotlines that connect struggling owners with pet food banks or emergency veterinary assistance funds. It looks like safe haven programs, which are incredible initiatives that allow people who are fleeing domestic violence or facing a sudden medical hospitalization to place their pets in temporary, confidential foster care for 60 days without having to surrender legal ownership.
And it looks like mobile veterinary clinics. Instead of telling a single mother working 2 jobs in a rural town that she needs to drive 40 miles to a clinic she can't afford, the mobile clinic drives directly into the underserved neighborhood. They set up in the parking lot of a grocery store or a church, and they provide free or heavily subsidized spay, neuter, and vaccination services right there, completely removing the transportation and cost friction.
And technology is beginning to play a massive role in this community-first approach. We are seeing the deployment of advanced digital intake systems, widespread subsidized microchipping to return lost dogs in the field without ever bringing them to the pound, and the very early frontiers of artificial intelligence.
AI is everywhere, and shelters are no exception. The data points to predictive algorithms being developed that can analyze historical community data to anticipate seasonal intake spikes, allowing shelters to proactively recruit fosters before the wave hits, or machine learning tools that analyze an adopter's lifestyle data and match it perfectly with a dog's specific behavioral profile, dramatically reducing the rate of dogs being returned for behavioral mismatch.
But all of these practical solutions, the mobile clinics, the AI matching, the TNR debates, ultimately force us to step back and look in a philosophical mirror. We have a profound contradiction in the United States. We spend $150 billion a year on our pets. We dress them in sweaters. We treat them like human family members. We establish pet trusts in our wills. And we fight vicious pet custody battles during divorces.
Yet simultaneously, we still legally tolerate and actively generate the systemic conditions that result in the euthanasia of hundreds of thousands of healthy animals annually.
It is a uniquely American contradiction. When you look at comparative international models like Germany, the difference is stark. In Germany, there are incredibly strict national laws. All dogs must be registered and licensed. The breeding of dogs is tightly regulated and taxed. You cannot just impulsively buy a puppy in a window. It requires effort and vetting.
Wow, so their system is completely different.
Totally different. As a result, their shelter system acts almost entirely as a temporary placement service for dogs whose owners have died or fallen ill, not as a mass disposal facility for a disposable consumer good. Their euthanasia rate for healthy animals is near zero.
We have this deep individual emotional intimacy with our own personal dog sleeping on our couch, but it completely fails to translate into a systemic, collective societal responsibility for the species as a whole.
Because American culture is deeply, inherently rooted in individualism. When a crisis happens, we prefer to point the finger and blame the individual irresponsible backyard breeder, or blame the individual impulse buyer, or blame the tired shelter worker. We focus on individual moral failings because it is easier than addressing the massive economic structures, the predatory housing policies, and the regulatory failures of the breeding industry that actually produce the crisis on a macro level.
Which brings us to the ultimate legal frontier of this entire debate, the moral and legal status of the animal itself. Under current American law, dogs and cats are classified as property, no different than a toaster or a bicycle. They can be bought, sold, traded, and destroyed by their owner, provided it doesn't cross the line into criminal cruelty.
But there is a rapidly growing, highly influential movement among legal scholars advocating for a fundamental shift in this status. They are arguing for recognizing animals as sentient property, or even pushing further to grant them a limited form of legal personhood.
The argument being that a being capable of subjective experience, capable of feeling terror, pain, and joy, has fundamental interests that deserve legal recognition beyond a simple property framework. If a dog has a form of legal personhood, A municipal shelter can't just throw it in a garbage bag because it is inconvenient or too expensive to house for another week.
Exactly. But this is where the debate gets incredibly complex. Because legal scholars who are deeply sympathetic to animal welfare also raise legitimate, principled, mechanical objections to granting personhood. They point out that the entire concept of legal personhood is built on a reciprocal structure of rights and duties. As a human, you have the right to life and liberty, but you also bear the societal duty not to harm others, to pay taxes, to obey laws.
It is mechanically difficult to assign rights to beings that cannot bear societal responsibilities. You can't put a dog on trial for biting someone. The dog doesn't understand the social contract.
Precisely. Many prominent scholars argue that completely blowing up the property framework to claim personhood might create legal chaos. Instead, they argue that refining the existing property framework, creating a special subcategory of sentient property that offers specific, robust protections against destruction and neglect while acknowledging the human's custodial role, is a much more legally stable and achievable path forward. But regardless of which legal mechanism wins out, the emotional reality of the human-animal bond has already shifted public opinion far past where the archaic property law currently sits.
We have covered an immense amount of ground today. We started with the brutal arithmetic of 20 million dead animals in the 70s. We unpacked the political genius and the mathematical loopholes of the 90% no-kill movement. We explored the devastating stigma attached to the biological fiction of the pit bull, the sheer unregulated scale of the rescue transport economy pulling dogs across the country, and the profound human failures, the lack of affordable housing, the veterinary deserts, the dopamine-driven impulse buying that manufacture this entire crisis from the ground up.
When you look at it in totality, it is a system that represents a genuine, spectacular moral achievement and a persistent, devastating moral failure existing simultaneously in the exact same moment.
It really is. And as we wrap up, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final, lingering thought to mull over. We talked briefly about how AI is beginning to be used in shelters to predict intake spikes and match adopters with dogs. But I want you to imagine, for a moment, a future not too far off. A future where those predictive algorithms become so advanced, so terrifyingly accurate, that they can map out with statistical certainty exactly which human lifestyles, which income brackets, which zip codes, and which housing situations will inevitably result in a surrendered or neglected pet.
That is a chilling thought experiment.
If we had that algorithm, and we knew it was right, would we ever accept a legal system that uses it to preemptively deny certain people the right to own an animal? Would we allow a computer to tell a struggling family they aren't statistically stable enough to experience the love of a dog? The line between protecting animals from human failure and using the guise of animal welfare to police and discriminate against human beings themselves is much thinner than we like to think.
That is a profound, deeply uncomfortable question to end on. And it is vital to explicitly state that this entire conversation is derived from the second book of the 30-volume series, To Preserve, Protect, and Defend the Soul of America.
Volume 2, Fentanyl Nation, Inside America's Opioid Catastrophe, authored by Sue B. Howell.
The book is now available in all Amazon bookstores across the world.
We absolutely encourage you to go check out the book, dive into the material yourself, and please leave your comments and provide us with your feedback. We would love to hear what you think about all of this.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.
Take care, everyone.